Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another fantastic show for you planned out today, and I'm very excited. Doc C joining us once again. You're scheduled for tomorrow as well, if I remember correctly.
I'm not leaving. I'm just going
So
to stay on here.
you're just going to stay.
Fantastic.
He's not
Pull
leaving.
up, pull up a chair, get comfortable.
Yeah, we get to go. So we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic today. Again, it is Resiliency Week, so we're going to be talking about the pillars of resiliency and just resiliency in general. But while I'm doing my rigmarole, make sure you guys do yours. Hit the like button, subscribe, hit the notification bell, do all that good stuff so you get your email every day that we go live, which is, of course, every day. The topic for today is going to be emotional toughness. Now, before we get into it, I just want to remind everybody that we are not doctors. Of course, Dr. Carlos is a doctor. So what he says, I would take pretty well. But again, still do your own research. So if there's something that interests you, by all means, look it up, get into it, use some critical thought. And if you have any comments or questions, by all means, hit us up in the comments section and we will discuss it as we go. Any thoughts or questions before we get into the topic? Pretty good?
I'm assuming that you're going to generally define it, etc.
Yes,
Okay.
I am. So I'm going to get into that right now. Here we go. So emotional toughness. Again, I'm summarizing from a few different places here, and it's actually quite handy now. Google does this for you; it summarizes things. But I've checked a bunch of these different websites, and it says emotional toughness is a personality trait that determines a person's ability to perform consistently under stress and pressure. It is closely related to qualities such as character, resilience, grit, and perseverance. Emotional intelligence is the bedrock of mental toughness, as it requires the ability to fully understand and tolerate strong negative emotions and do something productive with them, which I think is a great way to put it. And the way I've always looked at it was emotional toughness was the ability to manage not only your emotions, but handle other people's emotions when they're thrown at you. That was my personal thought on it. But what about yourself, Shaun? What do you think of emotional toughness when you hear it?
Well, my immediate default word is resilience. And so that's resilience internally and resilience externally to the world outside of me and the world inside of me. And so I think, depending on who you are, the largest battle could be external or the largest battle could be internal. And I think maybe a good way to start this conversation is to delineate between the two rather than blending the two, as it were, so that we can get to some maybe actionable items or at least have a better sense of what we're talking about. Though externally and internally, that resilience piece can be identical within both realms, but there are two realms, and we'd be remiss not to throw that out there.
Mirage, let's do that in a second. What's your initial thoughts, Doc C, on emotional toughness?
I guess I'll get it out of the way early. It's always complicated. There's so many, depends on context. You mentioned the great part, which is, you made an interesting point, Chance, dealing with other people's emotions. And that's one of the challenges for therapists is being able to listen to people day in and day out. And I'm more referring to people with trauma. That's where it becomes complicated because you can get what they call vicarious trauma by listening to it over and over again. You start taking it in, internalizing it, and that becomes an issue for that individual. I don't know if emotional toughness necessarily plays a role there, but it can to a certain degree. It's also the ability to put things in compartments. That's going to be another one. Understanding things, reframing things. Back to Shaun's got an interesting life in regards that I think he covers emotional toughness in two areas. And this is not the Shaun Taylor show, but it covers the area of sports and tier one. And both of those have really similar traits. And I know you and I have talked about this countless times. And I think this is where emotional toughness, you're really more almost the expert on this than a lot of us because you've had to do it in two different environments. In the tier one environment, and then obviously in the cycling, I forgot what you guys call it. I apologize.
Yeah, that's right.
The cycling, and that's a whole different environment too, because there is an emotional toughness. And even your friend right now, who's running Satch, he's got the emotional toughness component here. and discipline to be able to do it. So I think it'd be fascinating to see what questions you throw out in regards to emotional toughness, because when you have these special forces, when you have these athletes that endure these things and have to be able to deal with external distractions that they're going to happen and internal things. I think yesterday Shaun mentioned imposter syndrome, and that could be another internal conflict that people can have, is fighting their belief to be able to do things. All I can say, and I know this is kind of early on in the game, but we'll get it out of the way now, is one of the biggest things that I've seen for people who are emotionally tough, a lot of times, is training in that sense, providing feedback to them, and also self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something. It's not self-esteem, it's self-efficacy. I can feel good about myself but not be able to think I can actually talk here on the mic. And maybe I can't, I don't know. But self-efficacy is the ability to be able to believe I can do it. And I'm sure Shaun has a really high level of self-efficacy when he was in Tier 1. He also had it in biking as well, or cycling. Those are the two ones that he's going to have to be able to do it. And that's the internal conflict, right? The Shaun who says, I can't do this. I can't win this. I can't do that. I can't do this. With the Shaun that says, what the hell are you talking about? You've done it before. What have you done it before? So it's interesting. It's interesting to see that world with Shaun. I'm kind of curious myself, actually, to see where he goes with it.
Well, let's, Shaun, what do you think?
I do have some thoughts. And so before you started shining a bit of a spotlight on me, Doc, I was thinking about your opening comment, which made me shine a spotlight on you. And so you were talking about, as a therapist or as a psychologist, or in the capacity of engaging with a client and listening to their emotional up and downs, or their life stories, or their challenges, or what they're struggling with that day. Well, as in that professional capacity, since that is the profession that you're sitting in that seat for, you don't have much of a choice. You've got to listen to it. You've got to listen to that client. The only alternative to that is quitting your job. And so I think that that's an interesting avenue that I would like to explore at some point in this conversation. The difference between someone who has to show emotional regulation, emotional toughness, emotional resilience, emotional stress management, all of these things as the professional in the capacity of listening to someone talk about their emotional state. And why I was thinking that is because you'd made a reference to me in the sense of Tier 1 and in sports. And so Tier 1, of course, you've got to have emotional strength. In 24-hour solo mountain bike racing, to become a world champion, you've got to have emotional strength or emotional toughness. The difference is that one of those jobs was mandatory. One of them was participatory. I got to choose whether I wanted to do it or not, versus my first career where there was no choice. It was simply a case of I was obligated to demonstrate that emotional toughness. Whereas in my cycling career, I wasn't obligated to do anything, but I chose to do it. And so having to do it and choosing to do it are certainly two different things. So that brings me back to someone in a professional capacity as a therapist. They have to have a certain amount of emotional awareness and resilience. They have to have a certain amount of robustness to sit in that seat in front of a client and not be dogmatic about their emotional strength, because they have to ebb and flow with the client to some degree as well in order to synchronize or vibe in the conversation, as I see it anyway. And so emotional toughness is, I think, something that people kind of visualize in their mind as that stoic pillar of strength that everyone can rely on, including themselves. But I disagree. I feel that emotional toughness requires nuance and sensitivity and the ability to ebb and flow with the moment in order to synchronize with the situation that you're in, both internally and externally.
It kind of feels like we're in a jiu-jitsu match. But there's a lot of similarities there. You know, it's with jiu-jitsu, you have the roll and the flow, whatever you want to call it. You see Shaun doing a lot with his son. A lot of times you see him kind of flowing with your son or rolling. And it's interesting to watch because that's kind of the way you're describing how you're supposed to be as a therapist. In a sense, you're right. We have to kind of maneuver around and see what topics are being thrown at us, how to handle it, and how to maneuver around it. And when you have a little bit of tension on one side, you go to the other side. When you're working with people with trauma, if you start noticing that they're starting to have issues dealing with whatever they're coming up with in their mind, the memories, you have to start navigating around that. You have to slowly get into allowing them to be able to access that memory in a safer environment. Back to your question, Shaun, with therapists, a lot of things I teach the students is you got to understand yourself before you get in there. Because if you don't, you're not doing anybody any favors. You're not helping the client, and you're definitely not helping yourself. So if they haven't handled a lot of the things that they have in their own lives, that's going to be a problem. Because it's going to be traumatic for them when they go in and work with somebody. That's going to be a challenge for them. So they have to be able to process that in their own life as well as listening to somebody else's. Back to your point, as an athlete in a tier 1, it's the same thing, right? You have to be able to be in a certain mind frame to be able to handle mindset, to be able to handle things. I'm sure when you were training with athletes, and I'm not trying to kick it back to you, but when you're training with athletes, a lot of times when they're off, mindset, they're just not there. Fights with a significant other, family members, whatever is going on. That's a tough one to try to re-engage them back into where they're supposed to be. It's not that easy. So I don't know if that answered that question.
What do you think, Shaun?
Well, I think that one thing that just came out of the doc's points there, and it's related, but it's not. We're not heading in a singular direction here on this topic. It's kind of moving around a little bit. So, let's just go with the ebbs and flows of the topic, as it were. So, for emotional toughness, one of the things that the title itself is ironic, because I know guys who feel that they're really emotionally tough, that they're badasses, they're tough guys, they're fill in the blank title. And it's the title that kills guys. It's the title that holds them back. It's a title that spoils life's journey. That title of, I'm a freaking tough guy and nobody tells me what to do, or I'm a tough guy, I know how to be tough. And so the title is what I think holds a lot of veterans back. And particularly if it's a title from a long time ago, like 10, 15, 20 years ago, when maybe they were a tough guy. And in fact, it came up on my live IG chat this morning. A good guy, had said he wasn't like one of the tough guys like maybe I was associated with. But, that's an interpretation of the moment. And I feel that the individual who said that was a tough guy because he was in the same crew. He just had identified guys who, in his mind, were tougher, we'll call it. But that's when you're identifying tougher guys than the tough guy crowd that you're in. Now, what are you doing? Are you diminishing your toughness, or are you categorizing or yardsticking yourself against really, really, really tough guys? Now you're not a tough guy anymore. And so these titles, this emotional toughness title, can sometimes hold people back by them telling themselves that they're tough, and they're not willing to throw that title away. They're clinging onto that title desperately because they don't want to face maybe how not tough they are, maybe how vulnerable they are, maybe how sensitive they are, maybe how emotional they are, maybe in a negative emotional state that they aren't willing to face. Maybe they are so tough that they don't cry. But the moment that they start thinking about things, they're wanting to cry, and they're too tough to cry because that's the title that they've given themselves. And so I think that the emotional toughness title is a great title unless you're clinging to the title desperately without exploring the title.
This is I love doing this because there's a couple of times when this works really well where I just kind of plop out an idea and Shaun takes it exactly where I was thinking, which is, the concept of emotional toughness being that it's colloquially known as almost an oxymoron, right? Where you can't be tough and be emotional. But what I wanted to kind of touch on was where that line is drawn between those that think, oh, I'm so tough, I can't be emotional. There's no way you can be. Or they think that emotional toughness means that they don't show emotion, or they shove emotion down, or they push it off to the side, or they continually compartmentalize until the point that they have no emotion. So it's an interesting thing that Shaun kind of brought it up on his own. But I was going to ask a question about it, but Shaun brought it up on by himself. So I do really appreciate that. Quick one: the people watching, by all means, if you guys got questions, put them up in the comment section. Let's hear what you guys think about emotional toughness, so that we can engage all as well. But Doc, what do you think about that concept about people that are stuck in the title of being tough?
No, I think it's a great point by Shaun, and I'll take it this direction then. I'll leave it with that direction that Shaun wants to go. I like that. And I want to say, instead of title, I'll say is part of it. I think it's a subset of identity. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think a lot of people get in the military and law enforcement is where I see it a lot, and athletes too. So we talked a lot about the good stuff, but sometimes the identity gets stuck there. I might have told you with Larry Holmes' story already once, where he felt that nobody called him, nobody wanted to communicate with him once he retired. I had a friend of mine years ago who was a banker. He was always the hot to trot. Everybody called him. He had news spots that he would go on Bloomberg and CNBC and talk to their analysts and experts about things. And when he retired, nobody called him. And that was the identity. And the emotional toughness component is interesting because, let me get to that in a second, but when you have an identity like that, you become extremely vulnerable. And I know, I don't want to steer too far into that direction, but I know Shaun knows about this already. If you retire from the special forces, a lot of the guys tend to go, what am I going to do? It's my whole identity. And now I'm a Green Beret, now I'm not, or even though you really always are, and you get kind of lost. But the emotional toughness component of the crying, I'll go back to that. That's an interesting one. And you have to wonder if society dictated that. What I mean by that is if you look in the 1960s and 70s, and Shaun's already shaking his head, probably maybe going where I'm going. I'm a big fan of old Westerns like Rifleman, Gunsmoke, things of that nature. Then you go to Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood. I couldn't imagine Dirty Harry crying, or kind of Hang 'em High when Clint Eastwood was on there. What would that scene look like? But TV a lot of times influences us in a way of showing us how we think we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to behave. It dictates our relationships, it dictates our personalities. But I don't know if you guys noticed, there's a lot of people that tend to act like a TV actor. At least it did 20, 30 years ago. They would walk around, even say things that the actors would say in movies. And you're kind of like, wow, because I remember my dad and other dads, and I'm thinking, this is interesting. This is what you consider toughness. But in reality, I think emotional toughness, to bring it back to resilience, emotional toughness is the ability to bounce back and to endure whatever is going on. And I also think it's the belief, self-efficacy, and having the hope and the understanding that this is going to get better. It's got to get better. It's got to get better. One way or another, it's going to get better. And I'll hang out till it gets better. I'll keep fighting through it. And that's something that's interesting, because that's not necessarily what was taught. And I don't want to veer this off too much, but it is interesting because a lot of people act emotionally tough today without any experience to, how would you say, not to...
like to draw from?
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, not to draw from. They just don't. They just act tough because the guy looks a certain way in the movies, right? I'm just going to, this is me. I'm emotionally tough. I'll say a couple lines and do whatever. Because you don't see that in the world of martial arts very often. You don't see a whole lot of guys with black belts running around going, get out of the way, Shaun. Hey, chance. You just don't. They know where they're at. They know what they can do to somebody. And that's the emotional tough guy, in my opinion, is the guy who's comfortable enough when crap hits, they're fine. I'm going to have to deal with it. I'm not happy about it, but I'm going to deal with it. And I can get to crying later. That's an interesting thought too.
Shaun, what do you think?
Well, I agree. That's kind of how I was raised, or how I raised myself was, coming up through the late 70s, and then I graduated high school in 1982. And so back then there was there wasn't a movement, there wasn't a social phenomenon called strong male leadership, strong male role models. There was no how to be a man 101 courses. There's nothing. The guidance that you got was through fiction books, novels. The guidance that you got was through a weekly show that only had one episode per week, and it was a gunslinger, and that gunslinger was a male hero. That the role that he portrayed was, at the time, the prototypical male, the male that you were supposed to strive to be, and they were stoic. They didn't say much. They didn't do anything outrageous. They weren't blowing up 47 planes in 3 seconds. What they were doing was kind of standing, leaning against a dusty old wall, flicking a cigarette out towards the saloon, and then walking across the dusty street to go take care of business. And their face was, they didn't dance. They didn't pull all the faces. There wasn't a whole pile of music in the background. They just walked across. Sometimes the screenshot was their dusty boots, dustily walking across. You wouldn't even see the entire man, as it were. The imagery portrayed back then was small bandwidth. It wasn't a whole pile of dirty white noise messaging. It was really clean signaling. The essence of a man was, you didn't say much. You put your shoulders back, your chest forward, and you walked into the saloon, and you either shut the place up or you kick some arse. That was the messaging back then. To be emotionally tough, you didn't say much, and you caused trouble. But nowadays, the message is so all over the place when it comes to emotional toughness for men and women. You've got people out there who are not emotionally tough, acting out as if they're emotionally tough. You've got people who are emotionally tough, not wanting to get involved in the emotionally tough game because it's so dirty white noise right now. That I think the messaging on emotional toughness, on resilience, on adaptability, on positive mindset, on a lot of things that are involved with emotional toughness are being bombarded from all kinds of vectors right now, from the self-help $100 a month gurus all the way through to the 12-second clip of an NHL player saying something, some quip, some sort of little blurt out into the intosphere, and it's meaningless, but someone latches onto it and plays it up so it goes viral, and now we've got 4 million views of an NHL player saying something of no substance, but it's deemed as emotionally tough because maybe he spit when he said it, or maybe he just finished smoking someone on the ice with his hockey stick. Emotional toughness is so distorted now. It never started off well in the 80s, and now it's only got dirtier as a signal. And so how to put out a cleaner signal on what it means to be emotionally tough? Well, hopefully conversations like this will start tightening up the bandwidth.
Interesting. Doxy, you got any thoughts on that? Or I got something going on in my head, but you got any
No, I
thoughts?
mean, yeah, I mean, I think Shaun's right. Exactly what we were talking about a minute ago, that society, it might also remind me of a song from Whitesnake, Here I Go Again on My Own, going down the road that I've never known. And it's, again, the idea that I'm just going to add what to Shaun said, the idea of also I can do it by myself. I don't need anybody. I can live through this world on my own. And that's the theme that went over and over again in the 80s and 90s. And now today, I think it's a great conversation for the youth, because I think a lot of the males, young males especially, are trying to figure out, well, how do I become emotionally tough, or just tough, period? How do I be able to handle these things in life? And people just kind of say it, like Shaun said, you have little snippets of things. I can't tell you how many are popping in my head when Shaun said that, because I see them all the time, or I used to see them all the time on Instagram when they had popped up stuff like there's a Yoel Romero from the UFC clip where he's sitting there, you got to grab it. Grab. He has a little gravelly voice, and you got Jordan Peterson, and people, they got 100 accounts who are trying to get the video to go viral, and everybody's just trying to share these little quips. And it's kind of funny because it kind of almost desensitizes you to their message. And sometimes their messages are good, and sometimes it's out of context, like Shaun said. Sometimes there's not there. And I'll eventually give my 2 cents of what I think emotional toughness should be, in a sense, at least what I think. Doesn't mean it applies to everybody. But Chance, that's all I got.
Roger. I like how you guys put that, because while you guys were talking about like Gunsmoke and stuff, I was thinking, Unforgiven, and Clint Eastwood is definitely a typical, almost an idealized version of what that generation sought. Right? It was about stoicism, I guess, not in the terms of the actual philosophy, but in the physical presence of being stoic. Being able to accept other people's emotions just going everywhere, and being that one pillar of peace, I guess, right? that nothing else phases them, right? And I think it's interesting because the shots that you were talking about, Shaun, of like the boots in the dust, or the flicking of the cigarette, or the opening the saloon doors and all of a sudden it's on, they're snippets, like you said. They're pieces of the whole. And I think that nowadays we see more of the whole because communication happens so fast, whereas back in the day it was all about showing that aspirational trait, right? I'm walking on my own across the dusty road into the saloon. I'm going to look for trouble unless nothing happens, in which case I'll just do my job and carry on, right? The lawman concept of just, I'm going to grab the bad guy and go. But if he fights, I'm putting him down. That kind of, right? It's a very binary system. You either do what you're supposed to or you don't. And I think nowadays we see why the signal is so staticky in terms of what emotional toughness is because we're seeing all the little stuff in between now, right? In the old movies, you didn't see the gunman walking out of his house with his wife at home who was saying, oh, you're never home, and how come you're not doing all the things, right? And you never see that portion of it. You just see him doing his job. Whereas now, that's what we see. All of the other stuff as well, because it's everywhere, and everyone has a voice, and everything has it's like a buildup, as you were saying earlier, Carlos, was the fact that as a psychologist, you can absorb some of the traumas over time. And I think we're just all kind of absorbing everyone's traumas. So no one really has a clear signal as to what emotional toughness is. And I got a comment here, but you guys got any thoughts on that? Shaun, you're muted. You're muted, Shaun.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I just don't know what it is.
On your point there, where you were talking about the cowboy walking across to the saloon, and I guess my point / your point. So I think a big difference between the 80s and now, or the 70s and now, is this. Take those 3 trigger moments that you described, Chance. The guy gets off the wall, flicks his cigarette butt. That's evidence number 1. He's walking across the dusty road. That's evidence number 2. Pushes the saloon doors open. That's evidence number 3. All 3 clear signals of gonna take action. A man of action. Mm-hmm. That simple act of flicking that cigarette butt, back in the day, you knew it was going to be on. Oh, something's about to go down. Yeah. It's game on, man. It's freaking game on. Let's see where this goes. And as he's walking across the dusty road, he's walking at a clip. He's walking at a pace where, it's about to happen. Or maybe he's sauntering. And now you're curious. Now you're considering the emotional moment, and you're thinking, is someone going to get their arse kicked? Or is this guy just going to go in and say, all right, everyone calm down? You didn't know, but you knew that he was a man of action based on the simplicity of the moment. Saloon doors bang open. You know it's about to go down, but you don't know how it's going to go down. You just know that the simple message is being sent. Action. 40 years later, that cowboy, when he gets off the wall and he's about to flick his cigarette, there's freaking fireworks going off in the background. There's Hummers jumping over each other. There's a hot air balloon in the background. The cigarette is in midair, and as it spirals, someone TikToks it and turns it into a Broadway play where all the dancers and all the singers go straight down the dusty road that he still hasn't stepped onto. There's so much overwhelming signal in a simple message nowadays that the moment that cigarette is in the air, you've seen three Broadway plays. You've seen all of the singing, and you've seen all of the dancing, and you've seen all of the non-related advertising, campaigning, messaging, Jedi mind trickery that you're unaware of. It's all happened as the cigarette's in the air. The message used to be simple, that you could align with. Now, you don't even know who you are to align with. You don't even know the message to align with. You're not even sure what the scene is about. And so I think that the delineation between back in the day emotional toughness and today's emotional toughness, they're massively different, because back then the message was simple. You could educate yourself to some degree. Now the message is so dirty that who on earth can educate themselves in emotional toughness unless they're going to have the conviction to study emotional toughness? Start reading about it, start learning about it, start listening to your therapist about it, as it were, rather than getting it from a Bollywood cowboy movie.
Carlos, what do you think?
I think Shaun's right. I'm going to go back to your comment if I can.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is you made me think, and I mean, Shaun kind of alluded to some of the things too, but it made me think about out of context. There's a lot of people who live in today's world, and I've heard stories, and I'm sure Shaun's heard it, maybe Chance, I'm sure you've heard it too, where you've had people say, oh, in the gas station, this guy did this, but that's not a dusty saloon. It's not the Wild West, but he looked at me funny, or he said this to me funny. And they respond as that's the response that they have to give, is to be tough. We'll use the flicking of the cigarette analogy there. And all of a sudden I'm looking at it going, no, that's not a situation you have to do anything except say, you know, this guy's off his rocker. I'm just going to ignore it and keep going. I'll keep an eye on him, make sure nothing happens. But besides that, what's the point of this? A lawsuit, possible injury. There's no point in going on. And I think a lot of times the context, and this is where the big shift comes, this is where I think people will see something here, is they don't talk about their family life. This is what you kind of alluded to, Chance, is there's emotional toughness that's involved in being a family. And when having a family, one of your biggest shows on this program was your dad show. I think it had one of the 2,000 views or something like that. It was a pretty good view. That'd be a great week. It would be Dad Week and how to be a good dad, because emotional toughness, Shaun was starting to hit on at the end there. At least he was starting to open up that conversation of how do we get there. And it's being taught how to be emotionally tough. You know what? It's emotionally tough when you get the phone call that you got fired and you're providing for your family of 4. How do you respond to that? That's emotionally tough. A guy flipping me off at a gas station and me punching him is not emotionally tough. But me losing my job when my kids are in school, that hurts. All the fear of the world lands on that dad all of a sudden. And the mom, because the mom's trying to keep everything under control. Which is why let's say it's a 2-parent home. But a lot of us have been there. I've been there when I didn't have enough money to provide when my kids were young. And it's not an easy road. But you have a few options. What do? Do you cry about it and whine and say the world's unjust? Do you put up your boots and figure out, I got to make money? I got to figure out how to provide for my family one way or another. It doesn't matter what I feel like. It doesn't matter what I think about who's going against me. I got to get going. If I got to work 12 hours a day, 15 hours a day, I'll do it. Years ago, when I lost my job and I had to provide for my family, I was working 3 jobs. And I was working Friday at 7 a.m. and I went back to bed Saturday at 4 p.m. And I got back up at 8 because I had to go back to work again. And I didn't have a choice. And in my mind, I didn't have a choice. My mind is I have to pay the bills. I have to provide for the family. So to me, emotional toughness, I think sometimes gets taken out of context. I'm not saying you guys did it all. I'm just saying society has done it because they put it in these different scenarios where, no, it doesn't matter what the guy at the gas station did. It doesn't matter if the guy cuts in front of you in the line. What matters is how do you handle those phone calls? How do you handle when your mother dies? How do you handle when you lost your job? That's the ability to bounce back when it comes to resilience.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Shaun, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I do. When you were talking about taking that phone call to learn that you've just been fired from a job, there's a marked difference between emotional reactiveness versus emotional toughness. And so if someone isn't emotionally tough, they may react by throwing the phone through the wall when they learn that they've just been fired. But if they've got emotional toughness, they may take a moment, pause, and maybe then continue the conversation with why? Or is there something that we can address that I can stay engaged in the job? Or can you give me a referral? Can you blah, blah, blah? Can you stay engaged in the conversation is what I'm talking about, rather than taking the phone receiver and slamming it down on the phone and breaking it. That is reactive. That is not toughness. And I think that those two words are confused by a segment of society where they feel that being emotionally tough is actually emotional reactivity, where in order to demonstrate their quote unquote toughness, they're going to stand on top of a statue and pump their fist as if they are being tough. But all they are being is reactive. They don't have a handle on their emotional state. They are flaring out emotionally rather than being emotionally tough and containing those emotions through self-regulation. I'm not talking about being unemotional. I'm talking about regulating your emotions so that it's appropriate for the moment, rather than reactively flaring out with your emotions and being off base, as it were.
It's an interesting thought. I was just thinking to
100%.
myself, the concept of having your fist up. I pictured something in my mind is that there's a big difference between creating a protest or developing a protest or trying to protest the government or whatever it is, right? And organizing something like that versus going out in the street and yelling from the top of a statue, right? And I think that's kind of what you're going with in terms of, regulating your state, right? If there's something happens and I don't like it, okay, well, I'm going to start organizing. I'm going to get people together. I'm going to start talking about it. I'm going to start engaging the community to try and develop a plan to move forward. That's a regulated type of thing. But if something happens and I just immediately go out in the street and start screaming and like it is completely reactive. There is no toughness there. It's just immediate and it's kind of gratifying, right? There's a dopamine release a little bit when you're sitting there screaming all of your grievances to the world, right? Like bah, and I don't even know if there's an expectation there of things happening, but getting it off your chest does feel good. But if it's in a regulated manner, I think it's a longer lasting toughness, and it allows you to then draw on it from later. As you were saying earlier there, Carlos, was, there's lots of things happening right now in the world that a lot of us don't like, but what are we doing about it? Where are we engaging in? The people that I think are regulated, that have an emotional toughness to begin with, usually are the ones that are starting stuff like the collective or creating forums for people to speak out or organizing protests in the street. And then there's the people that are reactive, that are going to those things and then starting riots, if that makes sense. Guys, get where I'm going from on that one. Now I have a question here from Salty Jinx, but you guys got any thoughts?
Yeah, just before someone decides that they're unhappy with things and they're going to start planning a protest, versus someone who's unhappy with how things are going and they're not going to plan a protest, they're just going to stand on a statue and pump their fist. Those are two very different things, as you said, Chance. However, if someone is unhappy and they start thinking about, I'm gonna gather the community, I'm gonna figure this thing out, I'm gonna create a group of people, and we're gonna march towards someone's office, and we're gonna stand there with our signs peacefully. Before any of that happens, the person who's having these thoughts probably isn't sitting down quietly for a few days and thinking about, why am I unhappy? Why am I unhappy with being unhappy? Why happy, sad emotions? Someone isn't willing to sit down in their emotions and consider their emotions in order to better understand why they're emotional about a subject that they're going to create a protest on and then march towards whatever. Maybe before any of those protest signs are created, someone could just sit down quietly, maybe even talk with some friends, and figure out why they're so emotional about the emotional moment.
That's a great thought. Doxy, you got anything?
Yeah, but it's going to kind of answer Salty Jinx's comment too.
Roger.
If you want me to, that is
I'll
really
throw it up
theirs.
here. Yeah, by all means, dive in.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I think emotional intelligence is the ability to understand other people's emotions, being able to read them and their body language, but also goes to the point where Shaun was doing, I think it's where Salty Jinx was seeing it, that understanding your own emotions and how to respond. And I think you made a point too, Chance. Anger is not toughness either. And I think sometimes we see certain individuals on Instagram. Hopefully I don't get too much blowback from this, but hey, I don't have to worry about that. But they have this look all the time. And that's emotional toughness to them. That I have to look hard. And every message I give has got to be hard looking. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. Because do I want to really walk around life like that the entire time? Being furrowed browed and angry, and that's emotional toughness. And I think Shaun's got a great point in regards that emotional toughness comes with emotional regulation. And I think one of the things to do, if you look at children, you can start them off at the get-go by putting them in things that challenge them. Understanding defeat. If they play soccer, if they do jiu-jitsu, if they lose in baseball, it's okay. It's okay if you strike out. What do you do about it? That's going to be the emotional toughness. Fairy tales that we talked about before teach us how to deal with death, how to deal with tough situations in life and scary situations. And children start learning through some of the fairy tales. Same thing with superhero movies, right? They overcome. Every superhero movie, Batman, Superman, you name it, they've had some challenges, which is an interesting thing if you ever think about it. Almost every superhero has lost both parents. Just food for thought. Mm-hmm. But all of them have to overcome all kinds of things in their fights, right? They lose the first battle against the Joker, but then Batman comes back and wins later. Lex Luthor beats Superman the first time, and then he comes back. It's always coming back. It's a hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. You're always fighting back, and then you become sharper and better at the end of the whole journey. And a lot of times we don't want to get in there, but I think to build emotional toughness, it starts young. And if you haven't, if you grew up in an environment that they thought it was flicking the cigarette, then you learn from people that you admire, that are respected in the community, because you have to be careful who you pick. A lot of people think some certain individuals can be tough, and they're the bad guys. So we have to be careful with that. But you can pick individuals that have healthy emotional regulation, the ability to control themselves. And I know Shaun knows this because of the athlete world too. But sports, I think, is a great way to learn how to deal with emotions. Parenting is a great way. Hanging out with certain people is a great way. Friends that can guide you to go through things that are tough. Emotional toughness, I think Gary Sinek, you guys know him?
Yeah, I heard the name.
Simon Sinek? Or Gary V?
Simon Sinek, that's what it was.
Oh, Gary V. Simon Sinek. Yeah.
Okay. You get these guys confused. But Simon had an interesting comment. I think it popped up the other day saying, I don't let any of my friends cry alone. You can cry with me. And he was insinuating that some of these individuals didn't want to cry in front of other people because they were guys. But he provided them a space where they could. And I don't know if it's always necessary to cry. I mean, it can be. It's fine. I don't think society should dictate to you whether or not you should cry or not. I think that's up to you. I cry when my mom passed away. Things happen. Some things are worse than others. Things sometimes you can't even control it. But you build on those moments. My mom passing away, how I handled that will prepare me for my dad when he passes away. When my friends, I had 2 friends that passed away this week who were under 50 years old. You get prepared. It's a sucky thing. But you start learning about yourself. And I think that's a great point that Shaun made. You have to learn about yourself, understand your emotions and who you are. And that takes some work. I don't know if that answers Salty Jinx. I think I even got lost my own.
I think so. I think I know where you're going with that, but Shaun, you got any thoughts?
I do. So I think that back to the internal world versus the external world will give you all the messages if you're paying attention. But the internal world won't give you all the messages. You have to actively seek the messages internally. The external world will give them to you, but your internal, you have to hunt for them. They just won't bubble up for free. You've got to go looking internally to see how emotionally tough or not you are, how XYZ you are or not internally. You got to hunt. And so what do I mean by that? Well, you can tell if someone's emotionally tough if, irrespective of what's going on, they can keep a positive mindset. If you have friends who are constantly negative, they're not emotionally tough. If you have friends who are constantly positive, irrespective of what's going on, they're emotionally tough. Now, obviously, there's a huge difference between fake positivity and a real positive mindset. I'm not talking about the overexuberance of that falsified happiness. I'm talking about toxic positivity is right. I'm talking about a realistic emotional toughness where a person can keep a positive mindset irrespective of what's going on. Another good sign that someone has a decent handle on emotional toughness is if they're adaptable, their adaptability to the moment. So if something comes at you a little sideways and you crumble in the moment, you're not emotionally tough. I mean, there's no other way to say it other than get tougher. And how do you get tougher? Well, maybe we'll talk about that at another time. But definitely positive mindset and adaptability, problem solving, effectively coping with the struggles that are coming at you sideways, as it were. And while you're doing all of that, I guess the piece that the piece that I sometimes struggle with is I understand how to do it all, but I'm not always self-compassionate in when it's happening. So I'm kind of hard on myself as I'm trying to emotionally toughen up, as it were, which is ironic, I suppose. But I think having the self-compassion or the awareness that it is a tough moment and that it's my job in that moment to do my best and stay positive and adapt to the moment and not sweat the white noise details too much. Simply doing my best is literally how I create my own emotional toughness in the moment.
That's a great point. You got anything to add there, Doc?
I would just add to what Shaun said is right. To build emotional toughness, I think you need to do little things that make you tough. Little things that put you on the edge. I hate the phrase "embrace the suck," but whatever. You have to kind of do those things that challenge you in a way, and you have to be able to learn and to deal with adversity. And you can do that in a safe way, right? There's a lot of things. If you don't want jiu-jitsu, you push yourself. If you don't like jiu-jitsu, let's say, or you're afraid of jiu-jitsu, or you're afraid of mixed martial arts or martial arts in general, try it out. Deal with it. See how it works for you. Look at things. You go to Buddhism, anything you feel like you're too attached to, you think I can never not eat for a day, try it and push yourself. You learn little ways to do that. You know what? Because it cracks me up, and I think you guys would appreciate this. You get some guys that are really tough, and when you ask them to speak publicly in front of a crowd, they've killed I don't know how many people. They've been shot at I don't know how many times. They've lifted weights. They're about 6'8", 400 pounds. But put them in front of a classroom of 30 kids or teenagers, and they freak out. The public speaking, number one fear. And I'm looking at that going, well, there's emotional toughness for you. It's not just about being shot at. It's about handling all kinds of situations that we're afraid of. Sharing things with significant others that may scare you. I know you're running out of time, but
I love
things
that.
like that is interesting.
The interesting part is that you guys are both kind of alluding to it, at least in my head, and we're gonna get into some like how to become emotionally tough in a second here, but um, the concept. I'm gonna go back to the gunslinger. Back in those days, the message was simple, yes, but it left a lot of room for interpretation, right? If you didn't see the entire movie or you didn't see the entire show, all you saw was the dude who looked tough, flicked his cigarette, started walking, and then you didn't see what happened. You don't know if that's the good guy or the bad guy. You don't know whether or not that guy's intention is true or not. And that's why, back in those days, the good guys were so, as the white hat versus the black hat, right? The good guys were always in the white hat, so it was known. Um, Whereas now we have a lot more. We've tried to interpret the moment to such a fine degree that there is no room for interpretation except for your interpretation, if you know what I mean. And that goes into kind of what we're talking about in the emotional toughness is that if you have an emotional derailment, something happens that is huge, you lose a family member, you lose your job, all these things that could crush a person emotionally, a lot of times people fall back on the physical toughness, right? That's where you get the furrowed brow and the people yelling into the internet and saying, this is the world that's supposed to be like X. And I think that is the test of emotional toughness and kind of a degree is that to be able to remove the physical side of it, which is why I love jiu-jitsu for building emotional toughness, because throughout it, you're going to get your butt kicked. There's no question about it. You're going to get your butt kicked. I don't care where you come from. I don't care how big you are. I don't care how strong you are. You're going to walk in and you're going to get your butt kicked. How are you going to deal with that? Just that initial incident of I'm physically tough, therefore I am emotionally tough. Oh, wait, I just got my butt kicked. I guess I'm not physically tough. And that then applies to your emotional toughness. So what do you guys think? Tips, not just tips, but like tools, things that people can do to build their emotional toughness. Shaun, what do you think?
Well, I was just thinking about why would someone even bother? Why bother? It sounds like so much trouble. Sounds like effort. What's the point? Where's the statistics on getting emotionally tough? Where's the data to refer to clearly understand that it is a worthy pursuit? Why bother? There are no statistics on emotional toughness. Go out and take a look. You won't find any. Do you know why? Because emotional toughness is a phrase, it's a term that can be interpreted in many different ways. It's kind of a nebulous concept to some degree. You can't put your finger on it precisely, and therefore there are no statistics to measure on it precisely. Every single human is on a unique path. We're all in this common journey called life, but our own little paths are unique to us. And that's why emotional toughness can't be tracked. It can't be statisticized. It cannot be turned into a simple paragraph that is easy to understand as to why emotional toughness is important. So if it can't be measured statistically, how can it be measured to better understand that it's a worthwhile pursuit? The only way I know how is to observe people around me that I feel are positive, stable, manage pressure in the moment. They have good coping strategies. They are, to me, clear examples of well-balanced human beings who are not so tough that they're emotionless, but are tough enough that the emotions that they display are not to such a degree that they are a negative or a hampering emotion. It's a tricky balance to find out how to properly emotionally regulate out in today's world because there is so much white noise out there. If you're looking for what it means to be emotionally tough on the internet, good luck. I mean, you really have to search far and wide to find what emotional toughness means, because if you're only going to spend 10 minutes researching the subject, what you'll see is 100 different ways to be emotionally tough. And maybe 90 of them suck, are poor strategies, are not the way to do it. And so emotional toughness statistically is not something that you can prove to yourself that it's a worthy pursuit, but you'll definitely understand it as a worthy pursuit if you look around and find people who are emotionally tough.
Kind of goes into, why do martial arts if you're never going to use it? Why learn how to fight if you're never going to fight? That's just in case, like when things do happen, you might need it. Carlos, what do you think?
I agree with Shaun. I think it's important the emotional toughness is work. It is sucky because it isn't the most pleasant thing. And I think it's important for us to do it because if not, we go right back to what you guys were mentioning earlier, that if you don't, you become emotionally reactive.
Mm.
And this is one of the number one things we see a lot of with people who commit crimes. They're emotionally reactive. It doesn't mean if you're not emotionally tough, you're going to commit crimes. But a lot of people who can't have control, as you mentioned earlier, the fist, anger. Because they visualize anger as being tough, when in reality it's not. It doesn't mean there isn't a proper place for the furrowed brow, but they put it in weird contexts. If my wife says something I don't agree with, I try to override her with a nasty look and maybe raise my voice, raise my hand, Lord forbid. Things of this nature. And I think, so Shaun's right. And this is the tough thing about being human. Having to think critically takes effort. Having to be emotionally tough takes effort. As Salty Jinx talks about here, deliberate exposure helps. But personal experience helps. It's true. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Some people have life that's pretty easy. But you know what? They also learned about it. They learned that other people had it tough, and their parents taught them about emotional regulation. And yeah, they can get overwhelmed when something goes really south. Some people, very few, may have nothing. But most of us will go through something in our lives. The loss of our parents, loss of siblings, loss of friends, whatever it may be. You had Mark Ormrod on here a couple of weeks ago. Loss of limbs. How do you overcome that? Those are things that we can work with in our own experiences. But deliberate exposure, a little bit of your life, reading about it, modeling, all those things are huge. And being able to be much more emotionally tough and resilient, bounce back when things are challenges.
Mm-hmm. Shaun, you got anything on that?
I do. You raised Mark Ormrod's name, and he's been front and center in my mind during this conversation. Triple amputee, BJJ, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's an amazing, inspiring, emotionally tough story that Mark is a shining beacon or an example of how to do this better than most. And so I think if someone is trying to understand why they should get emotionally tougher, well, again, you can look at it quite simply in two ways, internally or externally. If you're going to talk about the external reason to get emotionally tough, well, you're doing that to help those around you. Maybe it's your family, maybe it's your friends, maybe through your actions, your passive actions, not pumping it out into the internet, yelling it all the time, but through your passive actions, you're demonstrating how to be emotionally tougher so that others can follow in those footsteps of themselves getting better at emotional toughness, that more balanced approach to life, if you will. But internally, when we're talking about internal toughness or emotional internal toughness, it's maybe the most important thing that you will do. Forget about the external world. If you can't get your internal emotions under check, it's not only creating problems for the external world, it's creating internal health problems for you. Your health. Every day that you're super angry at the world because you can't emotionally regulate, you're causing free radical damage in your body. You're causing all kinds of troubles, not just mentally, but biologically. If you can just find a way to look inside of yourself and ditch all of the luggage that you're the negative luggage that you're clinging onto, if you can just get rid of that stuff and just be a little happier today, just smile once today, now you're moving towards finding some emotional self-regulation, finding some emotional toughness. The first step, as they say, is the same as the 1,000th step. You've just got to take it. And so focus on your internal toughness today, your emotional resilience today. Find a way to be happier and more self-regulated today for your own health.
Yeah. I think at the base of it all, one thing we need to remember is that it's a choice. It is 100% how you perceive the world. And if you want to look at the world in a consistently negative space, then the world's going to be a consistently negative space. Doesn't matter how good you have it. If you're looking at the world negatively, it will be negative. And I think that it comes back to choosing. The example you used a second ago, Shaun, and then we'll do some final thoughts here, but was things go south and you crumble. Cool. I think everybody does that at some point. There's going to be a point where you crumble and you have to go, how do I do that better? Or you can get angry, and then the next time something happens, and you'll crumble again, and you'll crumble again. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. In order to get different results, you have to act in a different way. So I think that is a key thing, at least in my mind, in terms of emotional toughness, is you have to choose to do it better next time.
No, you don't. No one has to, unless they understand why they should.
Good point.
And why should you? Well, do you want to have a better professional life? Get better. Do you want to have a happier family life? Get better at it.
Yes.
You want to be better in sports? Get better at this emotional toughness. You want to connect with people easier? Get better at emotions. You want to ... It's, if you're in a negative spiral, you're only getting worse. But if you want to get better for yourself, you've got to start understanding how to self-regulate your emotions and getting more emotional toughness. But if you really want to help the world, you got to get involved in the positive world, not the negative world. And stepping out of your little negative spiral loop, that's tricky, man, because you think you're in a good world that's negative. It feels normal to suck. It feels normal to hate. It feels normal to point your finger at the world and say they're all doing it wrong. You're feeling pretty tough in there, in that negative spiral. The toughest thing you'll ever do is crack a tiny little gap in all of that negativity and see a little bit of positive light come in through that crack and then engage in it. That to me is emotional toughness, is breaking out of a negative loop and into a positive loop and staying engaged in the positive loop so that sometime in the future you can look in the rearview mirror, shrug your shoulders and say, who was that goof?
Thanks for ending the show for us. There's no way to finish that or follow that. Wow. But we're going to try. Let's do some, if there's any more final thoughts, or if those were your final thoughts, Shaun, but you hit the nail on the head 100%. Carlos, you got some final thoughts on emotional toughness or anything we've gone over so far today?
Shaun covered just about everything. The only thing I can think of is just make sure when you look at emotional toughness, it depends on the context of what you're talking about. Just like what I said a minute ago. Is it about being able to fight in the streets, or is it about being able to speak in public? Is it about being able to admit that you're wrong? Is it about being able to handle challenges in life like the loss of a job? Those are the tough things that I look at for emotional toughness as well. Everything is context based. Shaun kind of alluded to it because he was talking about emotional regulation, which encompasses all those areas. And if you can't emotionally regulate properly, you're going to have a hard time. But I think I wanted to my only last thought is just push people to think of where emotional toughness is in their life. What areas are you afraid? I don't know, can't tell you how many guys that I know won't even talk to a girl because they're afraid to ask them out. But yet they can do a lot of other things. So it's interesting. Push yourself a little bit. It's kind of going to the same point as Shaun. I hate to do it because I probably just diluted his wonderful message. But either way, push yourself to increase your emotional toughness.
100%. Shaun, final thoughts? Anything
Well,
left?
I'd just say this, that being a tough guy is not being emotionally tough. They're two radically different things. But if you want to become better at being a tough guy, get better at being emotionally tough.
Yeah, 100%. Well, this has been a great conversation. I know we went back and forth a little bit, external, internal, external, internal, but I think that both sides play into it very yin and yang ish, in that it is parts of both that affect us differently, and we need to be able to realize those and engage them how we want to engage them. So I think it's an important part of it. Um, Doc, thanks so much for the conversation. It's been awesome. Shaun, always good chatting with you. You know, the the best thing I get out of this every day, and it's a bit selfish, I get to learn all kinds of stuff, and I love talking to you guys because I get to learn every single day. And as I get to learn, y'all get to learn, and then you can build upon that knowledge and grow into the person you're supposed to be. So you can do that with us every day here on the Collective. We'll see y'all tomorrow.
Chimo.